I thought I was just running a simple errand for my sister. Instead, I walked into an electronics store and discovered proof that someone in my own family was slowly trying to kill my father. So, how did a broken laptop turn into a criminal investigation, and why did I freeze when the technician whispered, "You should see this"? My name is Serena. I work in marketing. I live a quiet life, and until that afternoon, I believed family meant safety. Today, I'm telling you the story of how I uncovered a betrayal so calculated, so cruel, that it shattered everything I thought I knew about blood and loyalty. And it all started on the front porch of my childhood home. The house sat on Maple Street in Mobile, a fading colonial with peeling paint and windows that always seemed clouded, no matter how much we cleaned them. The humid Alabama air clung to my skin as I stood on the porch, purse over my shoulder, preparing to knock. Before I could raise my hand, the door flew open. My sister Valerie shoved a silver laptop straight into my chest. "Take this to Geek Squad, now," she said, already turning away. "I'm late for a tea event downtown." Her voice was sharp, clipped, rehearsed. She looked flawless, perfect hair, pearl earrings, tailored dress, but something about her eyes felt wrong, too focused, too distant. Behind her, in the dim living room, my father sat motionless in his recliner. He didn't even look up. Dad used to greet me with jokes and warm hugs. Now he stared blankly at the muted television, hands folded in his lap like a forgotten statue. "Dad?" I said softly. Valerie stepped between us. "He's confused again," she snapped. "Thinks you're mom sometimes." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. She waved me off. "Just take the laptop, Serena, please." So I did. I told myself I was overthinking things as I drove to Best Buy. But the atmosphere in that house clung to me like damp fabric. Something was off, deeply off. I couldn't explain it. I just felt it. The Geek Squad counter was busy. Phones rang, customers complained. A young technician named Derek greeted me with a polite smile and plugged Valerie's laptop into his system. "Standard diagnostic," he said. I waited, scrolling my phone, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that followed me from the house. Then Derek stopped typing. His shoulders stiffened. He leaned closer to the screen, the color drained from his face. I noticed because it happened slowly, like fear spreading through him in real time. He glanced at me, lips trembling slightly. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "before I go any further, I think you should see this." My heart skipped. He turned the monitor toward me. At first, it looked harmless. A folder labeled, "Dad's Care Plan." I actually felt relieved. Care plan. That sounded responsible. But when Derek opened the spreadsheet inside, relief turned into nausea. This wasn't a medical schedule. It was a log. Row after row of dates and notes. Reduce heart medication by 50%. Add extra sodium to dinner. Insulin unavailable on high sugar days. Observe lethargy response. The columns were titled things like dosage reduction and physical decline. It read like an experiment. Like my father was being monitored, weakened, managed. My hands began to shake. Derek clicked on another file. Security footage. The living room. Our living room. I watched my father clutch his chest and collapse onto the carpet. Two figures entered the frame. Valerie and her husband, Todd. They didn't rush to him. They didn't call for help. Todd stepped over Dad's legs to grab the TV remote. Valerie laughed at something on her phone. My father lay there, gasping for air. 20 minutes passed. Only then did Todd nudge him with his foot. I felt bile rise in my throat. The store disappeared around me. No sounds, no people, just that screen. Derek looked at me with genuine fear. "I can call the police right now," he said. "This isn't neglect. This is cruelty." Every part of me wanted to scream, "Yes." Call them. Put them in handcuffs. But something colder and sharper pushed through my rage. Valerie was a master manipulator. She would say, "Dad, exaggerated." That he slipped. That they panicked. Expensive lawyers would shred this into misunderstanding and stress. And while the case crawled through court, they would finish what they started. I took a slow breath. "No," I said. "Not yet." Derek hesitated. "I need everything copied to a USB. I continued. Every file. He nodded, solemn. Minutes later, he placed a small black drive in my hand. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling like I was carrying a live grenade. 30 minutes later, I parked in front of my father's house again. I forced my breathing steady, forced my face neutral. Inside, Valerie snatched the laptop from me, without thanks. Dad sat flipping through an old photo album, hands trembling. He looked up at me with a flicker of recognition. Before he could speak, Valerie stepped in. "Dad, that's not your mother," she said gently. "You're confused again." His shoulders slumped. I watched her bring him lunch canned soup, so salty I could smell it from across the room. He was on a strict low-sodium diet. She watched him eat like a hawk. Her phone rang. She left the room. I leaned close to Dad. "You don't have to finish it," I whispered. He looked at me with tired obedience and lifted the spoon again. That was when I knew. This wasn't care. This was psychological warfare. And I was standing in the middle of it. I didn't leave the house right away. After Valerie walked back into the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear, I stood there for a moment, listening to her cheerful voice echo down the hallway, while my father slowly lifted another spoonful of that salty soup to his lips. My chest felt tight. Every instinct in me was screaming that I was watching something terrible happen in real time. I told Dad I needed to use the bathroom. Instead, I slipped quietly down the hall toward the master bedroom. This used to be my parents' room. I still remembered Sunday mornings when Mom would open the curtains and sunlight would spill across the quilt. Now, it smelled like expensive perfume and artificial flowers. Valerie had claimed the space for herself, filling it with designer clothes and vanity trays. I went straight to her makeup table. I didn't even fully know what I was looking for. I just followed the same instinct that had warned me at Best Buy. I opened drawers, moved bottles, lifted cotton pads. And then my fingers brushed against something hard and plastic beneath a pile of lipstick cases. Blister packs. Several of them. Dad's heart medication. The ones Valerie told us had been discontinued by the pharmacy last month. My stomach dropped. I stood there frozen, the evidence warm in my palm, as the reality finally settled in. She hadn't lost his medicine. She had hidden it. I put everything back exactly as I found it, my hands shaking, just as the front door slammed open. Todd had arrived. I stepped into the hallway and nearly collided with him. His tie was loose, his cheeks flushed, and the heavy scent of bourbon followed him like a cloud. He barely glanced toward Dad in the living room. Instead, his eyes lit up when he saw me. "Well, look who's here," he said, slinging an arm around my shoulders with forced familiarity. His grip was too tight. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You should tell the old man to sell this place while the market's hot," he muttered, gesturing vaguely around the house. "This land alone is worth a fortune. Taxes are killing us." Us. That single word told me everything. This wasn't about caregiving. This wasn't about stress. This was about money. I gently pushed his arm away and told him I had to get back to work. Walking to my car took every ounce of restraint I had. I sat behind the steering wheel long after the engine started, staring at the front door while tears burned behind my eyes. My sister was poisoning our father. Her husband was already counting profits. And they thought I was just the helpful little sister running errands. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad collapsing on that living room carpet. By morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. I drove through sheets of cold rain toward downtown, gripping my purse like it held my last lifeline because it did. Inside was the USB drive Derek had given me. I went straight to Mr. Patterson's office. He had been our family attorney for over 30 years. He had helped Dad with everything from property taxes to retirement planning. His office smelled of leather and old books, usually comforting. That day, it felt like a courtroom. He watched the footage in silence. Once, twice, 3 times. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. "This proves severe neglect," he said. "But neglect alone won't guarantee prison. Their defense will say they panicked, that they didn't realize how serious it was." He slid his glasses up his nose. "To put them away, Serena, we need proof of active malice, direct harm, forced signatures." Poisoning. Something undeniable. My heart sank. So what do I do? He leaned forward. You document everything. And you get your father medically evaluated. Immediately. I left his office with a new mission and a weight on my shoulders that made it hard to breathe. I called my best friend Chloe on the drive back. She worked in marketing and had the kind of voice that could sell ice to Eskimos. I asked her to pretend to be a receptionist from a luxury spa. She didn't hesitate. Within minutes, Chloe was on the phone with Valerie, offering a complimentary treatment package. I could hear Valerie's excited voice through the speaker as she discussed exfoliation and aromatherapy. While she was distracted by her own vanity, I slipped quietly into the house through the back door. Dad was sitting alone, staring at the rain streaking down the windows. I knelt beside him. Dad, I whispered, let's go for a short drive. He looked confused, but he nodded. I guided him to my car like we were sneaking out of school. We drove straight to Dr. Allen's private clinic. He had treated our family since I was a teenager. When he saw Dad, his professional smile faded instantly. He checked vitals, drew blood, asked quiet, careful questions. The waiting felt endless. Dad sat on the exam table, small and tired, while I held his hand and tried not to cry. When Dr. Allen returned, his face was flushed with anger. This is insulin poisoning, he said bluntly. His pancreas is fine. Someone has been introducing insulin externally. They're causing hypoglycemia on purpose. My knees almost gave out. If you hadn't brought him today, he continued, he could have been in a coma tonight. That was the moment it stopped being neglect in my mind. This was attempted murder. Dr. Allen wanted to admit him immediately. Every part of me wanted to say yes. But Mr. Patterson's words echoed in my head. Active malice. We still needed proof about the estate. I made the hardest decision of my life. I brought Dad back to that house. In the car, I explained everything as gently as I could. I told him we needed to pretend for just a little longer. He looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in months. And he nodded. That was when I understood how strong my father still was. And that was when I realized something else. They thought they were hunting him. But now, they were being watched. I drove my father back to that house through steady rain, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind racing faster than the windshield wipers. The doctor's words still echoed in my ears. If you hadn't brought him today, he could have been in a coma tonight. I glanced at Dad in the passenger seat. He looked small beneath his jacket, his shoulders slumped, his eyes half closed. But when I reached over and squeezed his hand, he squeezed back. That simple pressure told me everything. He trusted me, and that trust felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. Before dropping him off, I stopped by Mr. Patterson's office one last time. He handed me a small pouch. Inside were 2 high-definition micro cameras, no bigger than buttons, along with a portable receiver. These are legally admissible, he said quietly. They activate automatically and store footage remotely. Once they're placed, everything is recorded. I swallowed. How long do I have? He didn't sugarcoat it. Not long. I nodded, even though my stomach was twisting. Then I drove back to the House of Horrors. Valerie greeted us with forced warmth, touching Dad's shoulder as if she were the most devoted daughter in the world. Todd barely looked up from his phone. I played my part. I smiled. I thanked them. I pretended nothing was wrong. Inside, I felt like I was walking into a burning building with a matchbook in my pocket. That night, I barely slept. I replayed every detail in my head. I practiced conversations. I rehearsed lies. Every move had to be perfect. The next morning, I returned carrying grocery bags and what I hoped looked like a peace offering. I thought I'd cook dinner tonight, I told Valerie brightly. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, the works. You and Todd deserve a break. She studied my face for a long moment. Suspicion flickered behind her eyes. But greed always wins over caution. She nodded. Fine. I'm exhausted anyway. Todd grunted something from the couch, already holding a beer at noon. I started unpacking groceries while Valerie went upstairs for a long bath. The sound of running water echoed through the house. That was my window. Dad was dozing in his recliner. I moved quietly toward the bookshelf in the corner of the living room. Among old photo frames and dusty keepsakes sat a worn teddy bear Dad had kept since I was a child. My hands shook as I slipped the first camera inside its glass eye. Perfect angle, full view of Dad's chair and the hallway. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure Todd could hear it. I moved to the dining room next. The second camera needed height. I dragged a heavy chair beneath the chandelier and climbed up, stretching on tiptoes to secure the tiny device between crystal prisms. That was when I heard footsteps. Todd. I froze. He stepped into the doorway, beer bottle dangling loosely from his fingers. "What the hell are you doing up there?" he slurred. I grabbed a napkin from my pocket and started wiping the chandelier like a frantic housewife. "Dust," I said breathlessly. "It's triggering my allergies. I can't cook with this hanging over the food." He stared at me for a second, then shrugged and stumbled back toward the living room. I climbed down slowly, my legs weak. That's when I decided to set the hook. I walked up to him, lowered my voice, and said casually, "Todd, Dad told me something earlier. I think you should know." He looked up, suddenly alert. "He scheduled a meeting with his lawyer for Monday," I continued. "He wants to change his will. He's talking about donating everything to church charity." The effect was immediate. Color drained from his face. His eyes darted toward the stairs where Valerie was bathing. Without another word, he rushed upstairs. I stood in the kitchen, listening to urgent whispers bleed through the bedroom door. They were panicking. 10 minutes later, Valerie came down in her bathrobe, hair still wet, her expression cold and sharp. "Dad is confused again," she said flatly. "You should go home, Serena. Too many people in the house upsets him." I nodded, pretending to look disappointed. I grabbed my purse. I walked out the front door, and then I drove 3 blocks away and parked behind a massive oak tree. My hands trembled as I opened my tablet and connected to the camera feed. The screens flickered to life. Inside the house, everything changed. The moment they thought I was gone, their masks dropped. Todd shut off the television with a violent jab of the remote. He pulled a thick leather folder from behind the sofa. Valerie grabbed Dad's arm and dragged him toward the dining room chair. They shoved a pen into his trembling hand. From the chandelier camera, I could clearly see the document. Power of attorney. Dad shook his head. The pen fell to the floor. Todd exploded. He slammed his fist on the table, grabbed Dad's wrist, and leaned inches from his face. "Sign it," he shouted. "Your daughter isn't coming back." Dad whimpered, but he refused. Valerie turned away calmly and walked into the kitchen. I switched camera views. She opened the cabinet, pulled out a mortar and pestle, retrieved hidden medication bottles, crushed pills into fine powder, mixed them into a cloudy glass of water. She returned to Dad and tilted his head back. "Drink this," she hissed. "After tonight, none of this will matter anymore." I fumbled for my phone. My fingers felt numb. I dialed 911. "I have live video of an active poisoning," I said into the receiver. "My father is in immediate danger. Please send police and an ambulance to 124 Maple Street." I threw the car into gear and raced back toward the house. I don't remember much about the drive back to the house. I remember red lights blurring past my windshield. I remember my hands shaking so badly that I had to grip the steering wheel with both palms just to keep the car straight. And I remember the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears while the live camera feed sat glowing on the passenger seat beside me. On the screen, my sister was forcing a glass to my father's lips. Every second felt like a year. I screamed inside the car. I begged the dispatcher to stay with me, while I ran stop signs and barely slowed for turns. "They're poisoning him right now," I said, my voice breaking. "Please tell the officers to hurry." The operator kept repeating calm instructions, but all I could think about was Dad's weak hands, his tired eyes, and the way he had trusted me when I told him to hold on just a little longer. I had promised him. I couldn't fail now. The moment I turned onto Maple Street, I saw the flashing lights. Red and blue tore through the darkness like lightning. 3 patrol cars were already pulling into the driveway. I slammed on my brakes and skidded onto the lawn, throwing the door open before the car had fully stopped. The officers didn't hesitate. They stormed the porch with weapons drawn and kicked the front door in with a crack that echoed down the quiet street. I ran behind them, my lungs burning, my legs barely keeping up. Inside, chaos exploded. Valerie was still standing behind Dad's chair, the glass pressed to his mouth. The police shouted for her to freeze. She jumped in shock. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor, splashing cloudy liquid across Dad's slippers and the Persian rug she had once bragged about importing. Todd reacted exactly the way cowards always do. He bolted. He sprinted toward the kitchen like a trapped animal, knocking over a chair in his panic. 2 officers tackled him before he made it 3 steps. He hit the floor hard, crying out as they pinned his arms behind his back. Valerie didn't run. Instead, she collapsed to her knees beside Dad and transformed instantly. She grabbed his limp hand and began screaming hysterically. "Oh my God, help us! My father is having a massive stroke!" she cried, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "We were just trying to give him his emergency medication." For a split second, even the officers hesitated. Her performance was flawless. She looked exactly like a devoted daughter in crisis. I pushed past them. I stepped into the room and held up my phone. The recording from the last 10 minutes was already playing. Her own voice filled the air. "Drink this. Finish it. After tonight, none of this will matter anymore." The room went silent. Valerie's sobbing stopped mid-breath. Her eyes snapped to the screen in my hand. I walked closer, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "Stop acting," I said quietly. "It's over." The illusion shattered. One officer knelt to swab the spilled liquid from the floor for evidence. Another pulled Valerie's arms behind her back. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. She finally looked at me then. Not with tears. With hatred. Todd was lifted to his feet nearby, his face streaked with sweat and humiliation. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Paramedics rushed in and immediately began working on Dad. They checked his vitals, fitted him with oxygen, and carefully lifted him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside, my legs shaking so badly I had to hold onto the ambulance door for support. Dad opened his eyes. He squeezed my hand. It was weak, but it was real. That single squeeze broke something inside me. I leaned down and whispered, "You're safe now." As they closed the ambulance doors, I finally let myself cry. The house felt hollow once they were gone. Police lights reflected off the windows. Neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering. Valerie was led past me, screaming that I had destroyed the family, that I was jealous, that I was a traitor. I didn't respond. Todd followed, silent now, staring at the ground. When the patrol cars drove away, the street returned to darkness. But nothing about my life would ever feel normal again. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Dad had ingested sedatives mixed with heart medication. They stabilized him and admitted him for observation. I stayed by his bedside all night, holding his hand while machines beeped softly around us. He slept. I didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Valerie crushing pills. I saw Todd gripping Dad's wrist. I replayed everything over and over, wondering how close I had come to losing him. By morning, Dad was awake and asking for water. The nurses said his vitals were improving. I stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, finally allowing myself to breathe. That was when Mr. Patterson called. "They're charging them with attempted murder and financial exploitation," he said. "With the footage, the medical evidence, and the forced power of attorney attempt, they don't have a case." I closed my eyes. 6 months later, I sat on a hard wooden bench in the courthouse, while my sister and her husband faced sentencing. They looked smaller somehow. Stripped of confidence. Stripped of control. The teddy bear footage played for the jury. Dr. Allen testified about the insulin poisoning. The spreadsheets from Valerie's laptop were entered into evidence. There was nowhere left for them to hide. When the judge read the sentences, Valerie stared straight ahead. Todd finally looked back at me once. There was regret in his eyes. But regret doesn't undo damage. Dad recovered slowly. Once the drugs left his system, his strength returned. So did his clarity. He never had dementia. He had been chemically erased. We sold the old house. Bought a small cottage surrounded by trees. Dad planted flowers in the backyard. Some afternoons, we just sit together in the sun, saying nothing. And every time I look at him, I remember how close I came to losing everything. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Not just the air conditioning, but the atmosphere itself. 6 months had passed since that night on Maple Street. Yet every step I took down that long marble hallway felt heavy, as if my body still remembered the sound of breaking glass and sirens cutting through the dark. Dad walked beside me, slower now, leaning lightly on a cane. His strength had returned in pieces, but his posture still carried the weight of everything he had endured. Every so often, he glanced at me and offered a small smile, the kind that said, "I'm still here." That was all I needed. We sat on a hard wooden bench near the front of the courtroom. Across the room, Valerie and Todd waited at the defense table. They didn't look like the confident, polished people who once hosted dinner parties and bragged about property values. Valerie's hair was pulled back in a simple knot. Todd's suit hung awkwardly on his frame. They looked smaller somehow, stripped of their power and carefully constructed masks. Neither of them looked at us. The trial moved quickly. There was simply too much evidence. The prosecutor opened with the security footage the moment Dad collapsed, the way they stepped over him, the 20 minutes of silence while he struggled to breathe. I felt Dad's hand tighten around mine as the video played. Then came the spreadsheet. Valerie's so-called care plan. Rows of calculated cruelty, dosage reductions, diet manipulation, notes tracking physical decline. The jurors leaned forward in their seats. I watched their faces change as they began to understand that this wasn't chaos or caregiver burnout. It was a system. Dr. Allen took the stand next. He explained how insulin had been introduced externally to cause hypoglycemia, how the sedatives mimicked dementia symptoms, how prolonged dehydration and malnutrition weakened Dad's body over time. His voice was steady, professional, but beneath it, I heard anger. "This wasn't accidental," he said. "This was deliberate." The defense tried to paint Valerie as an overwhelmed daughter who made mistakes. They suggested Todd was simply under financial stress. They spoke about confusion, exhaustion, and misunderstandings. Then the teddy bear footage played. The room fell silent. The camera angle was grainy, but clear enough to show Valerie crushing pills, mixing them into water, and forcing the glass to Dad's lips while Todd shouted and shoved papers toward him. You could hear Dad whimper. You could hear Valerie say, "After tonight, none of this will matter anymore." That was the moment everything ended. Valerie stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. Todd lowered his head into his hands. I didn't feel triumph. I felt empty. When the judge finally spoke, the sound of his gavel echoed like a gunshot. Valerie was sentenced to 20 years for attempted murder and aggravated elder abuse, with no chance of parole for at least 15. Todd received 15 years for conspiracy and financial exploitation. All their assets were frozen to cover Dad's medical expenses and damages. Valerie never looked back. Todd glanced over his shoulder once as the bailiffs led them away, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret. But regret doesn't undo trauma. Outside the courthouse, Dad took a slow breath of fresh air. "I'm tired," he said quietly. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders. "So am I," I replied. We went home. Not to Maple Street. I had sold that house the moment the trial ended. Its walls held too many shadows. Instead, we moved into a small cottage in a quiet suburb, surrounded by oak trees and sunlight. The windows were wide, the air felt lighter, and the garden out back caught the morning sun. Dad chose the master bedroom. He planted hydrangeas along the fence. Every afternoon, we walk slowly through the yard, while he tells me stories I've heard 100 times before, about my mother, about his first job, about the summer I learned to ride a bike, and I listen like it's the first time. His recovery wasn't immediate. There were physical therapy sessions, follow-up appointments, long days when his hands trembled and nights when nightmares woke him in a sweat. But gradually, the color returned to his cheeks. He gained weight. His eyes grew sharper. The fog lifted. The doctors confirmed what Dr. Allen had suspected all along. Dad never had dementia. He had been drugged into submission, stripped of clarity by the very people who claimed to care for him. Sometimes I sit across from him at breakfast and watch him sip his coffee, steady and present, and I think about how close I came to losing him forever. All because I agreed to run a simple errand. Some evenings, when the house is quiet, the memories come back. Valerie's fake tears. Todd's grip on Dad's wrist. The way my hands shook when I dialed 911. Those moments live inside me now. But so does something else. Strength. I learned that evil doesn't always wear dark colors or raise its voice. Sometimes it wears pearls and pours soup. Sometimes it smiles at you across a dinner table. I also learned that justice doesn't arrive in a dramatic rush. It arrives slowly, through patience, documentation, and the courage to keep going when your heart is breaking. Dad tells me I saved his life. I tell him we saved each other. And maybe that's the truth. Recovery doesn't happen all at once. It comes in fragments. In the way my father slowly learned to climb the front steps without stopping halfway. In the way he began remembering the names of flowers again. In the way he started humming softly while making his morning tea. For weeks after the trial, I slept on a mattress on the floor beside his bed. Not because he asked me to, because I couldn't shake the fear that if I closed my eyes too deeply, something might take him from me again. The doctors warned us that trauma doesn't leave the body easily. Dad would wake some nights drenched in sweat, gripping the edge of his blanket as if someone were still trying to pull him away. On those nights, I would sit beside him and tell him stories from my childhood, reminding him of vacations we took, songs we used to sing in the car, silly memories that anchored him to the present. Slowly, his laughter returned. Not loud at first, just small sounds that felt like miracles. One afternoon, I found him standing in the garden, staring at the hydrangeas he had planted. "They're coming back," he said, touching a leaf gently. "So are you," I replied. And for the first time, he smiled without hesitation. The medical reports confirmed what we already knew in our hearts. His mind was clear. There was no dementia, no irreversible decline. What he had experienced was chemical captivity, sedatives to dull his awareness, insulin to weaken his body, salt to strain his heart, isolation to break his spirit. He had been erased inch by people who shared his last name. Sometimes, that realization still makes my chest ache. People often ask me how I stayed calm through everything. The truth is, I wasn't calm. I was terrified. Every decision I made felt like walking across a rope stretched over fire. One wrong move, one emotional reaction, one confrontation too early, and they would have destroyed evidence, spun lies, and continued quietly. I didn't win because I was brave. I won because I waited. I gathered proof. I listened to professionals. And I trusted that justice requires more than outrage, it requires patience. Looking back, I see the signs more clearly now. Valerie didn't start by poisoning Dad. She started by controlling his finances, by insisting on managing his medications, by answering questions for him, by telling everyone he was confused. Gaslighting is subtle. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It makes victims doubt their own memory. It makes outsiders uncomfortable enough to stay quiet. If there's one thing I want you to understand from my story, it's this. Elder abuse rarely begins with violence. It begins with isolation. It begins with control. It begins with someone convincing you that your loved one is just getting old. After everything was over, Dad and I took a short trip to the coast. Nothing fancy, just a quiet hotel and long walks along the water. We sat on a bench one evening, watching the sun sink into the horizon. "I thought I was disappearing," he said softly. I swallowed. "But you didn't," I replied. "You were still there. I just had to find you." He placed his hand over mine. "You listened," he said, "even when everyone else told you nothing was wrong." That moment meant more to me than any courtroom victory. Valerie and Todd are serving their sentences now. Sometimes people ask if I feel relief. I do. But I also feel grief. Not for who they became. For who they pretended to be. I mourn the sister I thought I had. I mourn the family dinners that were never real. I mourn the version of my life where trust didn't come with conditions. But I don't let that grief control me. Because Dad is alive. Because he gets to drink his coffee in the sun. Because we get second chances. There's a small framed photo on our living room shelf. It shows Dad standing in the garden, dirt on his hands, smiling like he used to when I was a kid. Every time I remember that survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like flowers growing back. Before I end this story, I want to ask you something. If you were standing at that repair counter, staring at proof that someone you loved was in danger, would you have called 911 immediately? Or would you have waited to make sure the truth couldn't be buried? There's no easy answer. But please, if someone in your life suddenly seems isolated, overmedicated, or afraid to speak freely, don't ignore it. Ask questions, pay attention, and never assume that family automatically means safety. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you to check in on someone who might need help, please consider subscribing to Hanjivie Iagi. Your support helps these stories reach people who may be living in silence right now. And sometimes, hearing one story is all it takes to save a life. Before we end today's story, I want you to pause for just a moment. What happened here wasn't only about betrayal or greed, it was about how quietly evil can grow inside familiar walls. Valerie and Todd didn't start with poison, they started with control, isolation, and small lies that slowly erased a man's voice. That's how abuse often begins, not with violence, but with silence. This story reminds us of something powerful. Listening to your instincts matters. Gathering proof matters. And protecting the people who can no longer protect themselves matters more than anything else. If Serena had acted only on anger, the truth might have been buried. But because she stayed calm, collected evidence, and trusted her inner voice, justice was finally served and her father was given a second chance at life. If this story touched you, please take a second to subscribe to Revenge Tale Network. Your support helps these stories reach people who might be living through something similar right now, people who may need courage, awareness, or hope. And remember, sometimes one story is all it takes to open someone's eyes. Thank you for listening.